Okay, let's talk about your activation. Do you remember the day that you received the phone call for your activation?
I don't remember the day, but I remember where I was. I was in my apartment in Amarillo, and I got a call uh, from Major Arnold. And I guess typically at the time, Sergeant Shin was our platoon sergeant, so he should have been the one because you would use the phone tree, right, and it would trickle down. But if I remember correctly, I think it was you that actually called me to let me know. So did you call all the scouts personally? There you go. That's why you called me.
What went through your mind when you got that call?
I was expecting it, to be honest with you. I mean, my LAR unit had already gone. They were part of the push in '03. And, we knew during the first Battle of Fallujah that the regimental leadership utilized 2nd Scout Platoon. And so it made sense to me that for the second Battle of Fallujah, the regimental leadership for their PTSD, for their PSD, personal security detail, would want a scout platoon, right? Because according to what we heard, those guys did a pretty fantastic job, and it was sort of kind of becoming a, uh, a secondary mission for a scout platoon since we weren't really doing reconnaissance for tank battalions at that time. So I wasn't surprised. I knew our number was going to come up at some point. I just, when you get that phone call, you kind of go, oh shit, I guess this is really happening now, right? So
What were some adjectives you would use to describe your emotion when you got the call? What did you do? Who did you call? Who did you notify? Help us understand the sort of perspective of a reservist coming to grips with the reality of a deployment to a combat zone.
yeah, I think I just kind of sat down and by myself, hung up the phone, and just sort of thought about it for a few minutes, like kind of just chewed on it, right, and kind of let it sit in. Again, I wasn't really surprised. I wasn't scared. Maybe a little excited. Um, but then you got to get down with notifying your family. So call my mom and dad, let them know what's going on. Call your buddies, call your girlfriends, your wives, whatever you have. Then you got to call work and say, "Hey, listen, I'm gonna need some leave." So,
How did your mom and dad respond?
mom, like any typical mom, was beside herself, terrified. Just knew that I was gonna get schwacked. Dad probably had the same fears, but he's a little bit more of a reserved guy. So he was kind of emotionless. Um, but mom, that's what moms do, right? They worry about their kids. She was not happy.
How did you help her through that?
I lied to her and told her that my job in the Marine Corps isn't a combat job, and that it wasn't dangerous, and that I would be safely behind the wire in the rear with the gear, as they say, um, and just let her believe that for a while. I mean,
Do you think she believed it?
she probably, at least for a while, because she doesn't really know much about the military. Even though we have quite a few family members, it's not something she ever really fixated on. My dad's a different story. I'm pretty sure, immediately saw through that lie, but I'm not so sure that he didn't keep that to himself just for like a sanity check at the household, at their house, while I was gone. So
Well, once you were notified that you would deploy, help us understand how a reservist prepares for that deployment. So what I'm asking is, what are the steps that you went through prior to your initial location training in California?
well, so unlike an active duty unit where everyone's there, with onesies and twosies that live out in town with like wives and kids and whatever. But you've got your main component in barracks. Everybody's together. The leadership can already start getting people to ensure that they have all their gear. One of the things that we have to do is all our gear as reservists is at the house. You know, so you'll eventually get a gear list. So you're actually collecting all your gear at home, trying to make sure you have everything. You don't have ready access to all the supplies that a normal active duty unit would have. So you go about putting yourself together and all your gear together in the best way that you can before you report to what we used to call the bull hall, the reserve center. And that's where it sort of starts taking on more of an active duty feel, right? You can start requesting missing gear if you're missing something or whatever the case is, and it becomes a more formalized process, right? But for a reservist, it begins as a very individual process. And I feel like that's obviously very unique to the reserves, because I don't think the active duty guys ever feel that process begin in such an individual way.
Well, help us understand, paint a word picture for us. Pack your gear. What went into that bag? What went into that gear that would later go to war? Help us understand that.
I mean, everything that the Marine Corps has issued you, right? Like your pack, your uniforms, your boots, your 782 gear, deuce gear, whatever you want to call it, your snivel gear, we used to call it, like things like gloves and your watch cap that would keep you warm, your sleeping bag, right? All of that gear that you need to have to be effective in a combat zone so that you can live away from civilization or forward deployed, as scouts usually are. You had to have all that stuff. And so ultimately that comes down with, if you're smart, or if you're forward thinking, is go ahead and gathering everything up that you best know. And then you wait on getting that gear list. And once you get that gear list, you can actually go through and check everything off to make sure you have everything required. Does that sort of answer your question?
Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. Let's get in our time machine, and it's the day of reporting to the bull hall,
Yeah.
as you called it.
Yeah.
The day that you're supposed to arrive and you're officially on active duty. Help us understand what that day was like.
Having gone to numerous drill weekends there, it sort of felt like I was pulling up for drill. You drive into the parking lot, the gates are opened, you park, make sure your uniform's squared away, you get out of your vehicle and you go inside and check in with, whoever your platoon sergeant is at the time. It became different when, everyone was called to attention. You came out and addressed everyone as being on active duty now and gave us the official notification that we're on active duty. And then we got after it. We got to work like any good Marine Corps unit would. Everyone's bringing their gear in so that the different tiers of leadership can begin inspection to ensure that everybody has everything they need. And that was a little bit different because whether you're going to drill or whether you're going to AT, some of that happens, but not with this level of like, it was almost like a level of ferocity that was taking place. And because you had officially notified us that we were on active duty, that's when the air kind of changed. Like, you're not going home after this weekend. You're not going home after these 2 weeks in Kentucky or wherever we're training. We're going to California to begin a workup, and then you're going to the Middle East. And that's when like reality kind of set in, and that's when it kind of started sitting on top of your head. You're like, oh shit, this is real. So
let's talk about California, because as I understand it, about 8 or 9 weeks was spent in preparation at what's known as the ILOC, the initial location of training prior to deployment. If you can, help us understand the various phases of that training, because I think it's important that Americans understand how we prepare our reservists for combat. Could you share some of that experience as you remember them?
Yeah, I mean, sure. It's been quite a few years, obviously, going on 20 now, but you would arrive as a unit, right? And initially, I believe we arrived at Camp Wilson, which is the Quonset-hutted area of 29 Palms. It may not be that way anymore, but at least when we were there, it's like the old Quonset huts that I was used to from Camp Upshur when I was with the LAR units, which are basically half-domed, corrugated tin barracks, if you will, right, with a sand floor, and you live on cots in there. So we would report out there to Camp Wilson. We got moved into our billeting area, and we began all the administrative stuff, right, the administrivia. So filling out all the paperwork, making sure everything is checked in triplicate, Then you go through another round of, medical stuff. You're getting checked out by the base corpsman, making sure that you're healthy enough to be there for training and that you're in a deployable status. And then once we got done with the administrative side of the package, we moved out into some training areas. And one thing that 29 Palms had done is they had employed some actors for the urban settings, the mount facilities that I talked about a little bit earlier at Fort Carson. And so we began moving through these training packages. One portion was mount, clearing towns, clearing rooms, clearing buildings. One portion was, call for fire, right? When you would learn to, or better improve your skill, because as scouts, this is something that was part of our duties, calling for indirect fire, whether it be artillery, mortars, air assets. And the thing about 29 Palms is it's so huge. They have different training locations so that you're out there for miles and miles and miles, depending on what training package it is. The mobile assault course, which is a live fire exercise where you're, advancing on your feet. So you would start hitting all these different training packages. Another one I left out was combat driving, right? Where you don't spend a lot of time at full speed with the hammer down in a up armored Humvee, when a war is not on. That's a hard vehicle to contain and handle because you're not driving 35 across, some training area. You're hammering it in combat at times. So the Marines had to learn how to do that. So the various different skills that would be applied in a combat scenario, we had a station at 29 Palms during the ILOC training or the workup that we would practice each of those individual skills. And then there were people that we affectionately called coyotes, and I guess that was probably almost like an industry term, which are active duty personnel that are observers that watch each individual training package that we would go through to ensure that we were up to snuff with those skills, and they would either fail us or pass us. And obviously you had to pass. So you're observed by the active duty units, because the point is you're supposed, as a reservist, at least in the Marine Corps, I'm not sure about other services, but you're supposed to seamlessly integrate into an active duty unit so that there should be no difference between you're on active duty now, but you're a prior reservist, or you're on active duty now and you were on active duty the whole time. You should have the same level of skill. So,
did you feel that the training you received was adequate?
I did. I was quite pleased with it. I mean, it was a lot of long days. I think you mentioned earlier we were out there for like 8 or 9 weeks. I mean, that's a good amount of time to be training pretty much every day. I don't know that we had more than like 3 or 4 days off. Like, I can't remember. We didn't have weekends off. I don't think so. Yeah.
I mean, did the training give you confidence, or did it inject some doubt in your mind of what lay ahead?
I think it gave us confidence. I mean, you spend that amount of time working on all those different skill packages that I talked about as a unit, you begin to function as a team much better than you did, even though you were already a team. But in the reserve world, you're not doing it as often, right? But when you're out there for 8 or 9 weeks, every day, every night, training together, you really pull together cohesively as a cohesive unit, and that really gave me confidence, because I know that our commander's intent, and really the Marine Corps' intent, was that if I went down as the section leader or sergeant, that whoever in my vehicle, a lance corporal or a corporal, could step in and cover down on my responsibilities. And that's one of the things that the Coyotes would routinely do when we were being tested, is they would take some level of leadership out of the game, right? Whether it be myself or Major Arnold or Sergeant Shin, they'd kill us off during the testing phase, and the corporals and lance corporals would have to fill in and complete the task. And our guys did that. So I think they learned well.
Do you recall any very specific leadership challenges you faced as a section leader prior to deployment?
Not really, because our guys were such a good group of guys. I mean, there were 1 or 2 personality differences, I guess, but I think that's common across any unit, active or reserve, doesn't matter. So I think learning to work around maybe some of the personality conflicts was part of it, because one of the things that makes reservists so different than active duty guys is these reservists are coming in and they're their own boss in their civilian world, right? Like they may have a boss, but they're not beholden to a Marine Corps rank structure their entire lives like active duty guys are, right? You know, these guys may be very successful in the civilian world, but they're a Lance Corporal or whatever in the Marine Corps Reserve. And now they're taking direction and orders from someone who they may even think that they're smarter than, or for lack of better terms, better than. So you have to learn to lead and understand that you're talking to people that for the majority of their lives, they are not living in this environment. They are maybe quite successful in what they do outside of the Marine Corps. So it's kind of hard to take a CEO and make him a Lance Corporal, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the day of departure. Help us understand the day that Scout Platoon deployed to Iraq. Talk us through that.
I mean, you know, we were eventually sent out to, and you'll have to forgive my, because memory, of course, fades as time goes on. I want to say, you know, we loaded on a civilian bird that was chartered, so it was just Marines heading over, and that was out of California. And I remember, you know, it was a long flight, and it was a 747, I believe, because it was an upstairs, and some seats were forward, like the officer corps sat forward of the pilots. And I just remember that the flight attendants were super nice because it still had a crew, right? A flight attendant crew, because they're actually not there to like serve you dinner. They're there to be your safety personnel in the event of a crash landing, right? So even though there was no other civilians on there, but a shit ton of Marines, they were there. And I just remember them being very kind. And I've flown a lot in my civilian capacity, and I've never seen flight attendants be this nice. And it was almost in like a motherly way, because they sort of were concerned for us, I guess. Were worried about what was going to happen to all these young men that are on their bird. And it was a unique experience seeing flight attendants interact with you, almost, like I said, almost motherly. So there we go, right? We land in Germany for refueling, back up in the air, and then we finally land in Kuwait. Now you're in a nice air-conditioned bird for forever, hours upon hours upon hours, with a very brief fueling stop in Germany. And then you pop the door and you walk down the flights, or the flight stairs, I'm sorry, out into Kuwait, and it is burning hot, just balls hot. Everything is brown. Everything has a coating of dust on it. There's no other, it hurts your eyes. There's no other color but brown. You ever, you know, you're cooking a pizza or whatever, and you open the oven and you stick your head too close, and the 450-degree oven hits you in the face. It's literally like that when you're walking down the stairs for your first, because I had never been to the Middle East before, and I was like, holy shit, this is hot. So we finally get everybody off the plane. Everybody's sweating. Everybody's shocked at the actual heat. Unreal. And we get our platoon formed up and mustered up, and then we start going and looking for our bags, right? Because our bags are on board with about 1 million other Marines in their bags. So now comes the task of digging through this giant pile of sea bags, which is, I'm pretty sure that's why they do that at boot camp. They throw all your shit together in the middle of the squad bay, right? And then you got to go digging and find your own. I don't know if that's the case, but that's what it felt like. So finally, we found all of our gear and got our platoon formed up, and our platoon commander, Major Arnold, addressed us and kind of told us what the orders of the day was going to be. We're going to go find our billeting. We're going to do the sea bag drag and drag all of our trash over to our assigned Lawrence of Arabia tent, as I call it, which is these giant tents, which were amazing because they freaking had air conditioning inside of a tent. And the tents had floors. Strange. So that was it. We got our gear over to our tents. We got released for the day, and we're told to muster back up in the evening.
And so you're in Kuwait at this point.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about your transition to Iraq?
Well, we spent a couple days in Kuwait, and we would have routine formations to make sure that everyone was accountable. But we're kind of waiting on our team's slot to get into one of the birds to get over into Iraq. And so I remember that there was some mechanical troubles with some of the airplanes that we were supposed to be on. And so that kept pushing us back. I believe we stayed like an extra 2 days maybe. And so it was kind of boredom at that time. And the Marines were kind of chomping at the bit. And you kind of have to like herd the cats, like at least I did in my section, because a bored Marine is a terrifying thing. That's where the trouble starts. But eventually we got on a bird that was quasi working, and I remember we're in the back of this C-130, and it's hot as hell back there. Everyone's falling asleep because the heat is putting them to sleep. Like everyone is sweating, nodding off, and we would scream down the runway to try to pick up enough, momentum to get airborne. And then for whatever reason, we would stop because something was wrong with the plane, and we'd come screaming back in the other direction. We did this a couple times, and eventually we got airborne. But before we did, that plane was shit canned too. And so we had to get off the plane. And one of the kind of a comical story is we had a corporal in our unit named Corporal Johnny Longcott. And he was tasked by Major Arnold to carry our security ammo. Because one of the things that civilians probably wouldn't understand is when you're going into a combat zone from a secure area like Kuwait, you're not full up in ammo most of the time. Some units will be because they'll have special taskings, right? But you'll always have security rounds on you. And Longcott's job was to hold on to this ammo can full of rounds that he could pass out in the event that something happened and we were shot down or whatever. And so that way all the Marines would have some ammo to repel, our boarders, right? Our downed plane. But Longcott had been passed out from the heat for so long, and us driving up and down the friggin' runway so many times. When that ramp dropped and we're all shuffling off the ramp, he thought we were in Iraq. And so he rips open the ammo can and he's starting trying to pass out ammo, and all the Marines are cracking up at him. They're like, dude, we're still in Kuwait. We haven't freaking left the airbase in Kuwait yet, right? So a little bit of an embarrassment point there. But he's a good dude. He took it in stride and laughed with the rest of us. But the next day, we eventually got out on a working bird, and we landed at Al Asad Air Base, which for our war is the entry point for most of the conventional forces, sort of like Da Nang was during the Vietnam War. Everyone went through Da Nang. Everyone went through Al Asad in Iraq. So we landed in Iraq, but one of the things that I remember that was a little bit memorable was the normal takeoff in Kuwait, but the spiraling, very steep landing in Al Asad. And it's my understanding, I was told, I don't remember by who, but the air crews do that to make themselves a harder target for any insurgents on the ground, because now we're actually in Iraq, right? And so that was when you're just in those strap seats in the back of a C-130. That's it'll get your attention. So we're in Al Asad now. We're there for a couple days, and it's a huge, huge base. And I actually had a friend that two friends that I worked with at a bar that I bounced at when I was at Virginia Tech. One's name was John Doyle, and he was part of the infantry unit there at Al Asad that was in charge of the hamlets around Al Asad and basically the base's security. Then the bartender, John and I were both bouncers. The bartender was a guy named Steve Fleming, and he was a crew chief on the 46s, the helicopters, the Chinook. And he was there too, because that's where his air team was stationed. And so when I got my guys squared away enough, knowing that we were going to be there for a couple of days, and I got permission from Major Arnold, myself and a buddy of mine from the platoon named Ben Bias, Corporal, or at the time Lance Corporal Bias. We went and we found John's unit, and his team was in charge of all the night patrols. So it was daytime, and so he was asleep. So I went into their bunker, and they were utilizing old Iraqi weapons magazines as their bunker because they're hardened concrete structures. And I went in and kicked his rack while he was asleep, and he was like, "Holy shit, what is Smith doing here?" Right? So we got him awake, and we went and checked a Humvee out of the motor pool, and we went over to the air side to go to try to find Steve, because how crazy is it, that 3 guys that went to tech together that are in 3 different units are all in the same place in a foreign war. But sadly, Steve was already he was out flying at the time, so we didn't get to run into him. But like I said, Al Assad was huge, and this is where we first got the first sounds and maybe the first taste, if you will, of enemy incoming fire. And the reason that I say it was so huge is because, we got mortared numerous times while we were there. And when I say we got mortared, they were impacting on the base, but it was so far away that no one was in any danger, right? But it's the first time that you hear, okay, someone's actually trying to shoot at us, and they're using, indirect fire. So that's big explosions. You're like, okay, these people are serious, but we were in no danger because they were impacting so far away. I think we kind of just looked off into the distance and saw the mortars impacting and kind of went back about our business. So that was sort of our introduction slowly into the war zone.
Now, how did you get from Al Assad Air Base to Camp Fallujah?
So our assignment was going to be the regiment, as I mentioned earlier, the regimental commander's personal security detail for the second Battle of Fallujah, right? And I'm not sure if it was OPSEC at that point, and maybe I knew because I was a section leader and the acting platoon sergeant, or if the entire platoon knew at that point. I can't remember. I would imagine it was still under OPSEC, and I just knew where we were going. But initially we were told we were going to fly in. We were going to fly from Al Assad in choppers down to Camp Fallujah. And I've heard a couple different reasons why we weren't. I've heard that ground fire was so ridiculously high at that point that they didn't want to put birds up. I've heard that there were no birds available because they were busy with other taskings. And I believe that one probably to be the truth because, that's what they get paid to do. They're not going to care if they're getting shot at. So that was scrapped. We're no longer taking choppers all the way across Iraq from Al Assad down to Camp Fallujah. So we load into the backs of, I couldn't even tell you how many 7-ton, open back 7 tons. And we made a hours upon hour, I don't remember how many hours it was, 6, 7 hours, something like that, ride down a highway, just knowing that we were going to get hit with IEDs the whole way. And so we drove through the middle of the night, basically halfway across Iraq, all the way down to Camp Fallujah. And our convoy was so long that we had the troops in the open back 7 tons. We had security elements of Humvees that had heavy weapon systems on them, Mark 19s, 50 cals, what have you, that were our security element because we're just a bunch of assholes in the back of a truck with some M4s. And they're zooming up and down the convoy trying to protect us. And at one point, something happens at the head of the convoy, and you can see it looking down the line of trucks, that you see tracer fire going out into the desert because it's dark. But the convoy was so long that whatever happened up there had little to no effect on us, 2/3 of the way back. So it was a massive convoy all the way down to Camp Fallujah.
Okay, tell us about once you arrived at Camp Fallujah, what were your initial tasks?
Let's see. Well, Sergeant Shin, our actual platoon sergeant, had gone ahead, and he had sort of his task was to get our billeting area squared away. So in his absence, I as the first section leader, step in as platoon sergeant, as acting platoon sergeant. And so my job was to sort of herd all the guys, get them formed up, make sure that all the gear is unloaded, make sure that we go find Sergeant Shin and find out where our billeting is going to be, get everybody loaded into those, billeting areas where we're going to stay for the duration of our time at Camp Fallujah. While, of course, our platoon commanders off making liaison with all of the the camp leadership.
At this point, did you know what your mission would be?
I'm pretty sure, like I alluded to before, I can't remember, it's been so long, whether the entire platoon knew at that point, but I knew, and I know Major Arnold and maybe and Shin knew that we were going to be participating in the Second Battle of Fallujah. So